if neurologists study brain diseases and disorders, then what do psychiatrists study? I realized, by the way, when I was typing that question, it sounded like a knock-knock joke, like somebody should be like, oh, they study, But, you kind of go back to this idea of neurologists study the brain, right? So psychologists study the mind, right? That seems about right. But then you have to define the term mind, and good luck with that, because this is something that's been debated in philosophical circles, since the beginning of time. The mind has historically been the subject of these philosophical questions as opposed to medical inquiry. But if you're talking about psychiatry as a medical field, and psychiatry studies the mind, then all of a sudden what was a philosophical question becomes a medical question. The mind-body problem, for those of you that have a philosophical background, is really one of the most important debates within the field of philosophy. So to give you a brief description, the idea is what exactly are the relations between the mental and the physical? And in particular, how can there be causal relationships between them? So how does anything in the body cause anything in the mind and vice versa? From a medical perspective, the mind-body problem comes into play when you talk about how the mind and the body interact in maintaining health or causing disease. Within the field of psychiatry, right, rather than looking toward the objective physical markers of health and disease, psychiatry has a unique challenge because they need to rely on the personal, introspective experience of the individual. So psychiatry deals not only with the brain, because psychiatry does indeed also deal with the brain, but also the mind and the ways in which the brain and the mind interact within the individual to produce patterns of thought and emotions. It's very hard to objectively measure the details of someone's hallucinations. You can hear them. You can ask somebody to describe them when you're talking about depression. Even something, like that, it's very difficult to measure objectively how depressed someone is or what it feels like to be depressed. So the question that comes up, more often than not, can psychiatrists satisfy the public's legitimate demand for objectivity and impartiality in clinical judgments while assessing the contents of a domain, the mind, that is fundamentally personal, private, and internal, and thus subjective? And my answer to this would be no, because psychiatry is not the same as physical medicine. Now, I pause here just to say that it's very important. I always want people to understand that I'm not anti-psychiatry. There is a movement called the anti-psychiatry movement. I don't know if any of you have ever heard of it. A man by the name of Dr. Thomas Zaz. It's very influential in the field. My argument is not that psychiatry is invalid. My argument is that psychiatry could be better utilized by adopting the techniques from the field of medical humanities. Okay, so some of the differences between psychiatry and physical medicine. Psychiatry is subjective and value-weighted. Physical medicine is objective. And I put the word objective in quotes because anyone who has any background in philosophy, you will get yelled at if you ever say anything is objective. So to the extent that something can be objective, physical medicine is seen as being objective. Psychiatry is really based on these philosophical concepts of the mind, normality, abnormality, whereas physical medicine is based on scientific data. All of you in here, all medical students, what do you do when you go to labs, right? You're doing things that are scientific. You learn all about the scientific method and, how to kind of better use all these scientific techniques, which is something that in psychiatry is a little bit harder to do. Psychiatry is based on the mind, which is intangible and private. Physical medicine, brain, tangible, public. Psychiatry is more imprecise descriptions. As I said, you're asking somebody to talk about their hallucinations, right? It's going to be a subjective account of what their hallucinations are or what depression feels like to them, as opposed to, the more quantitative measures that could be used in physical medicine. And again, this idea of normality versus abnormality or health versus illness. So those are really what each of these two fields come down to. So how did modern psychiatry transformed from its inherently philosophical humanistic foundation to its current status as a subset of medical science. There are three major milestones that are really responsible for this transformation. The first is the Enlightenment. The Age of Enlightenment kind of gave these increasing levels of prominence to reason, progress, order, classification, and science. So not to go too much into a history lesson for you, but the idea of the Enlightenment stressed that the achievement of societal progression could be obtained through the use of reason and science. And that emphasis on reason and science was something that led to the earliest forms of psychiatric segregation and classification. Why? Because if you are stressing that society is based on reason, you're going to want to remove the unreasonable elements from society. The unreasonable elements being the insane. So really, in the Age of the Enlightenment is where you started getting the introduction of asylums, where people who were considered insane were secluded and confined and then studied. Once they were studied, even though chronologically there's a large difference here, that kind of causally connected the idea of the Enlightenment to the neo-Keplernian diagnostic revolution that took place in the 70s, where there was this emphasis on diagnostic classification, more so than there had been with the previous editions of the DSM, because again, it was more quantitatively based. And the nosological methods that were first introduced within the field during the Enlightenment were really what paved the way for the neo-Keplernian classificatory revolution that took place in the latter part of the 20th century. In turn, the increased disease specificity of the DSM-3 then enabled psychiatric researchers to develop drugs that could better target these specific diseases. So as I just said, the Age of Enlightenment, the goal was to use reason and science to help society progress and ultimately achieve perfectibility of mankind. It was a very optimistic time, and the leading scholars of the field truly did believe that using these ideas of reason and science, we could create this kind of utopian environment. Descartes had established the mind as a distinct entity of reason. And then the mind was seen, this distinct entity of reason was seen as being the natural state. So everything all of a sudden became about objectivity, became about science, reason, and making society progress through that. In order to achieve perfection, though, you need to get rid of the imperfect people in society, and as I said before, this is where the introduction of asylums came in. So this is just a quote for you. The Enlightenment promised that human suffering would yield to the advance of rationality and science. And for its part, psychiatry sought to replace spiritual, moral, political, and full understanding of madness with the technological framework of psychopathology and neuroscience. So there you go with the beginnings of medicalization. Followed next by Kreplin's work in classification, and then the emergence of the neo-Kreplinian movement in the late 20th century. So the DSM-3, as you, I'm sure all know sitting here, was really the distinct point where we went from this kind of idea of descriptive, qualitative psychiatry to a more scientifically based quantitative system of classification. And this new era of scientific psychiatry aims to emulate the methods and the procedures of physical medicine. How do you do that? You have to emphasize practical, disease-specific treatments, but mostly you need to be able to identify what is a disease, what is a mental illness, right? So on this kind of boundary, we took away the idea of problems of living, we took away the idea of diagnosing people based on a spectrum, and instead we went to a categorical definition of mental illness where, you have obsessive compulsive disorder because you have 3 of the 5 items that, signify that this is an unhealthy way of living. And then kind of once we did that, once we were able to develop a set of criteria that could be used to standardize and regulate scientific research and investigation, the shift from descriptive Freudian psychoanalytic techniques to this standardized research criteria really took place. So you all have a copy of this, so you can read this quote later if you'd like. But basically, what happens when you can identify specific diseases? Well, if you can identify them and classify them, the next step is to develop a treatment for them. So in the 1920s, physical medicine was working very hard on developing their magic bullet that would cure a lot of the ailments that were coming at the time with the war and everything. And in 1929, Alexander Fleming discovered penicillin, which was seen as physical medicine's magic bullet. Psychiatry needed to emulate physical medicine, so there was a search for a psychiatric magic bullet that would allow people suffering from severe mental illness to live a normal life. So chlorpromazine was first, in 1954 was the first time that it was sold in the United States under the name of, anybody know? Thorazine. Very good. And it was first distributed by a Philly-based pharmaceutical company, SmithKline and French Corporation. So anyway, once we had drug therapy for mental illness, the next step was to kind of widely distribute it. And once it was widely distributed, we were able to go to the next step with the deinstitutionalization of the mentally ill. So now what's ironic about this is that the Enlightenment was the first major milestone, and the Enlightenment introduced the idea of institutionalizing those who were suffering from mental illness, and we came full circle with the development of psychopharmacology, and psychopharmacology allowed people to leave the asylum because there was medications that we could theoretically give them that would allow them to have a quote-unquote normal life. So, you have the how, but what about the why? Why did this happen? So psychiatry was involved in their own identity crisis and has been for a long time, where the field is constantly defending the profession against those who question its validity. I mentioned before Dr. Thomas Zaz and the anti-psychiatry movement. You don't hear much about an anti-cardiology movement. People are pretty pro-cardiology for the most part, you know. There's no like anti-pediatrics, you know, people like pediatrics. But psychiatry is kind of always coming up against these same issues. So there's really a search for a definition that would differentiate the field from other similar people that are working right now and honestly sometimes charging less for similar services. Psychologists, social workers, clergy, etc. So psychiatry decided, well, let's classify ourselves as a subset of physical medicine. And then we can do things that the psychologists and social workers and all of that can't do, which means that we really carved out a niche for ourselves. And now, you know, also we can charge for money. Fantastic. So the question now is, psychiatry has self-identified as a subset of physical medicine. I'm sitting here telling you that I don't really think that's the case, but where does psychiatry belong? So there's the two ends of the spectrum within the field and within the people like me in medical humanities and philosophy and things like that, that study the field. There's the two ends of the spectrum, biomedical disease-based model and the problems of living model. So typically, people who believe in the biomedical disease-based model of psychiatry tend to fall under the scientific psychiatry heading, and they believe that psychiatry is a physical science and should be treated as such. And the other ones kind of fall into this problems of living and say, no, psychiatry is not part of medicine. We shouldn't be giving people medicine for it. You know, it's not a real illness. It's different. So anything you can see there is this idea of the categorical definition of the two ends of the spectrum versus the dimensional definition, which is more what I'm arguing for. Medical humanities, in and of itself, is a hybrid of medicine and humanistic disciplines. So, as you can see from this quote, psychiatrists, in trying to establish a specific space for them within medicine and a distinct professional identity, fails to appreciate that psychiatry is the only clinical discipline within medicine that's concerned primarily with the study of man and the human condition. So right there, if you want to differentiate psychiatry from other fields, that's how you do it. It is inherently different. Medical humanities, usually when I talk about this, the first question everybody asks is, what is medical humanities? So medical humanities is an interdisciplinary field that aims to unify the scientific and humanistic facets of medicine. So going back to this dimensional definition of psychiatry that I was talking about before, if you take the important scientific developments that have taken place, I will certainly not stand here and say that the development of psychopharmacology was entirely a bad thing. There are plenty of medications that do allow people who otherwise would be confined to asylums to live a much more normal life. However, science should not be the only foundation of psychiatry. We need to take these humanistic facets of medicine and apply the humanistic disciplines to the matter of medicine and the human condition. Technology is advancing at a very rapid rate. Within the past 50 years, there have been an incredible number of technological developments, but advancing technology should not come at the expense of understanding the human body, understanding the human experience, understanding the human condition. And that is the heart of psychiatry, the idea of understanding human experience and understanding human condition. We can use the humanities to explore the human condition as it pertains to medicine. So the various cultural and creative expressions, values, outlooks, attitudes, and lifestyles of patients, because those impact health and medical care. They're not just interesting side notes. They're very important to the patient's story. And as physicians, when you have a patient that comes into your office, yes, you're interested in the exact reason why they're there at that moment. But sometimes you need to understand what brought them there and where they hope to go next in order to adequately care for them. So why put psychiatry under the umbrella of medical humanities? At a physiological level, a panic attack during a near-fatal climbing accident in a psychiatrically healthy individual or in a crowded shopping mall and a patient with agoraphobia are probably the same. Okay? But what differentiates the two? It's the context of the experience. If you were solely measuring the physiological symptoms of those two patients, they would appear to be the same. However, the first person, just casually in talking about this, I think everyone would say, hey, if you're involved in a near-fatal climbing accident, your blood pressure should spike a little bit, that's normal. Not everybody would agree that if you're in a crowded shopping mall, you should have the same type of blood pressure spike. So it's important to understand the context of the experience in order to accurately assess the situation and then render a diagnosis. Scientific medicine and humanism are intertwined that way. You can't separate one from the other. You need to understand the experience in order to understand the condition. This idea of qualia. I'm not going to get too philosophical on you. I have to tell you that qualia is one of my favorite things to talk about. The idea of qualia is this experience, it's the idea of the experience, right? So you can never fully understand what it's like to be me. I can stand here right now and I can tell you what it feels like to be speaking in front of people on this topic, but you can't fully understand it because it's a wholly subjective experience. Psychiatry, by definition, is built on these inherently subjective ideas. So, in order to truly understand someone's mental state, the best thing we could do is listen to them, describe what it feels like, and use these tools that are oftentimes lately ignored in medicine. And by doing that, you're kind of thinking outside the box, you're using these non-traditional methods, and that's really what I would argue all of medicine, but in particular psychiatry, really needs to do. The benefits of aligning with medical humanities. As I said, you get the best of both worlds. The mind and the body, the mental and the physical, the philosophical and the scientific. Helps foster a better relationship between the physician and the patient, which is essential to psychiatric care. Of all the doctor-patient relationships, arguably the most important one is the relationship between the psychiatrist and his patient or her patient. It's a long-term relationship, and in order for therapy of any type to work, you need to be able to trust the provider. You need to be able to believe in their methods and feel that they're understanding you. Listening to the patient from the physician's perspective broadens your diagnostic skills and results in more accurate medical assessment. It also has been proven to prevent physician burnout. The improved relationship, better relationship between the physician and the patient leads to improved patient compliance and therefore better treatment outcome. Patients are more satisfied and malpractice litigation is reduced. So, the future of psychiatry, well, I would argue that the future of psychiatry still involves differentiating psychiatry from other fields. The difference is that my argument is not to do that by aligning with medical science, but to do that by aligning with medical humanities. Psychiatry is a uniquely experiential field and requires unique methods. It's essential to go back to these philosophical roots and to understand the importance of qualia, of subjectivity, and then not to ignore the modern scientific advances either. You want to give the patients the best care possible, so you need to use any tools at your disposal to do that. Utilizing methods from the humanities, literature, film, art, patient narrative, as tools for understanding the experience of mental illness. Kay Redfield-Jameson, I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with her, she is a prominent psychiatrist out in California and also suffers from bipolar depression. And she wrote several memoirs kind of describing her experience. And you know, if you're reading these memoirs, again, you can never fully understand the experience of another person, but it can at least help you understand what it feels like. My personal favorite that I recommend to everyone is A Beautiful Mind. I think that Russell Crowe was robbed of an Oscar that year because I think that he did such a wonderful job of really depicting what it's like, particularly for someone who's an academic, for somebody who their brain is their defining characteristic. It's, you know, it's all that. It was all about, for John Nash, this idea of, you know, his intelligence and being a professor and coming up with these wonderful theories, mathematical theories, and then what happens when your brain turns on you? And now you can't trust your brain anymore. But you've used your brain to define yourself. So it goes to really the core of personal identity. You know, by using some of these things and by using various other methods from the humanities, you're really able to better understand. And as physicians, being able to better understand your patients means that you can better diagnose them, you can better treat them, you can work with them and ultimately help improve their lives. And you know, hopefully that's the reason why all the medical students in this room are in medical school. So instead of identifying solely with medicine or philosophy, psychiatry currently has a unique opportunity to establish itself firmly at the heart of the field of medical humanities. Obviously, as someone who studied medical humanities, I think that's where psychiatry should be. And I also think that this idea of medicalization is something that is not solely going on within psychiatry. It's a lot easier to argue against the over-medicalization within psychiatry because the nature of psychiatry is such that it does combine both the philosophical and medical sciences. But, you know, as Greg said before, the other work that I do has to do with bioethics and the Holocaust. And I go back to there and I look at the medicalization that took place in Nazi Germany and the medicalization of race, the medicalization of religion, and this merger between medicine and politics. And you can see the detrimental effects that that had. So the warning that I put out there to all of you is, despite what you may or may not be taught in your medical education, be cautious when it comes to over-medicalizing. Don't ever forget that your responsibility first and foremost is to the person. And if you can remember that, if you can remember to ultimately your responsibility lies with that person and the one-on-one relationship and the experience between the two of you, you will be much better off in the long run, both on a personal level, in terms of your own fulfillment, and also just in terms of improving the field. And to me, you know, I think that really, whenever I give this talk, that's always what I hope the takeaway message is just kind of to, sometimes you don't need all the fancy technology and the tests and the medications and the scans and all that stuff. Sometimes you just need to sit and look at a patient and ask them. Okay, that's my piece.